The river was restless that afternoon, its currents churning with an unpredictable force. The wind howled through the towering pines, rustling leaves that whispered of an approaching storm. John Matthews, a retired forest ranger, had seen the river's wrath before, but nothing could have prepared him for what he saw next. At first, he thought it was just debris, a large, dark mass being tossed mercilessly by the waves. But then it moved, struggling against the current, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a bear, a massive black bear, its powerful body now fragile against the relentless river. Its soaked fur clung tightly to its frame, and its paws flailed against the current. The animal's head dipped under the surface, resurfacing with desperate gasps. It was drowning. John's instincts kicked in. He had spent his life protecting the wilderness and the creatures that called it home. But never had he faced a moment like this, standing on the riverbank, staring at a wild predator in peril. Common sense told him to stay back. A bear, no matter how weak, was dangerous. But his heart told him otherwise. Without hesitation, he grabbed the rope from his truck, tied it around a sturdy tree, and plunged into the frigid water. The river was merciless, pulling him downstream with the same force that had trapped the bear. He fought against it, stroke after stroke, until he reached the animal. Up close, he could see the fear in its dark eyes, the exhaustion in its movements. "Hold on, big guy," John murmured, as if the bear could understand. He looped the rope around the bear's torso, securing it tightly. Then, with every ounce of strength left in his body, he pulled. Inch by inch, he guided the massive creature toward the shore, the weight of it almost too much to bear. The cold seeped into his bones, his muscles screamed in protest, but he refused to let go. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the shallows. The bear collapsed onto the rocky shore, heaving with exhaustion. John fell back, gasping for breath, his entire body trembling. For a moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the roaring river behind them and the heavy breathing of man and beast. John expected the bear to bolt, to disappear into the forest without a second thought. But instead, it did something that sent a shiver down his spine. It looked at him, not with fear, not with aggression, but with something else. Something John had never seen before. A silent understanding. A moment shared between two beings who, by all logic, should have been enemies, but in this moment were something more. And that was only the beginning, because hours later, something would happen that no one, not even John, could have ever imagined. A miracle. The icy river surged like a wild beast, its currents twisting and turning in an unpredictable dance. John Matthews had seen plenty of storms in his time, but this was different. The water churned violently, swollen from days of relentless rain, swallowing anything that dared to challenge its force. That's when he saw it. At first, it was just a shadow amid the waves, a dark form bobbing up and down. But as he focused, realization hit him like a lightning strike. It wasn't just debris, it was alive. A bear, a fully grown black bear, caught in the clutches of the raging river. John's breath hitched as he watched the animal fight for its life. Its massive paws clawed at the water, but the current was too strong. It was losing. Its head barely broke the surface before being pulled under again. The bear was drowning. John's pulse pounded. His truck was parked just a few yards away, his radio crackling with static. He could call for help, but by the time anyone arrived, it would be too late. He was the only chance this bear had. His hands worked fast, grabbing a length of rope from the back of his truck and tying it securely to the thickest pine he could find. His survival instinct screamed at him. This is a wild animal. It's dangerous, but something deeper inside him wouldn't let him turn away. He took one last breath and plunged into the river. The shock of the freezing water sent daggers through his chest. The current was relentless, shoving him backward as if trying to claim him too. He forced himself forward, one stroke at a time, eyes locked on the struggling bear. "Hold on, big guy," he muttered through clenched teeth as if the bear could hear him. The closer he got, the more he realized how exhausted the animal was. Its movements were sluggish, its body sinking lower and lower. It wouldn't last much longer. John reached out, his fingers brushing against the thick, drenched fur. The bear flinched, a weak but instinctive reaction. He braced himself, heart pounding, expecting the bear to thrash, to fight, to see him as a threat. But it didn't. Instead, for a brief second, the bear's dark eyes met his. There was something in them, not just fear but trust. A desperate, silent plea. "Help me." Summoning every ounce of strength left in his body, John looped the rope around the bear's torso, gripping it tightly. The animal was massive, easily over 300 pounds, but the water made it lighter, easier to guide. Still, every pull was a battle against the current. Inch by inch, he dragged them both toward the shore. His muscles screamed, his vision blurred, but he refused to let go. The bear's body sagged against him, too weak to resist. It wasn't fighting him anymore. It was letting him lead. By the time they reached the shallows, John's limbs felt like lead. He stumbled onto the rocky shoreline, chest heaving, arms trembling. The bear collapsed beside him, water streaming off its thick fur as it lay motionless, gulping for air. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the roaring river behind them, and the ragged breaths of man and beast. John turned his head, expecting the bear to lurch up, to bolt into the trees without looking back. That's what wild animals did. But it didn't move. Instead, it just lay there, its great chest rising and falling. Its eyes, those deep, intelligent eyes, were locked onto John's. Gratitude. John didn't know how or why, but he felt it. The bear knew. It understood. And then, something even stranger happened. Slowly, painfully, the bear lifted its massive paw, just slightly, and let it drop against the ground next to John's hand. Not on him, not as a threat, beside him. A gesture so small, so deliberate, that it sent a shiver down John's spine. He exhaled shakily, his heart still racing. "You're going to be okay, buddy," he murmured, barely believing the words himself. The bear blinked slowly, its body still, its breathing steadying. And in that moment, John knew this wasn't over. Because whatever had just happened between them, whatever fragile, impossible bond had formed in that river, was only the beginning. And hours later, something would happen that neither of them would ever forget. A miracle. John had seen plenty of strange things in his time as a forest ranger, but nothing prepared him for what he witnessed the morning after he saved the bear. The storm had passed overnight, leaving behind a crisp, golden sunrise filtering through the trees. John, still sore from the rescue, stepped onto his cabin's porch with a fresh cup of coffee in hand. His muscles ached, and the memory of the frigid river still clung to his skin. Then he saw it. At the edge of the tree line, just a few yards from his cabin, the bear was still there. John had expected it to disappear into the wilderness the moment it regained its strength. That's what wild animals did. They ran, they survived, and didn't linger. But this bear hadn't left. It was sitting there, watching him. Not aggressively, not fearfully, just watching. John let out a slow breath, careful not to make any sudden movements. The bear was still weak, its soaked fur now drying into thick tufts. Its breathing was steadier, its massive paws planted on the earth as if trying to ground itself. But what happened next made John's jaw nearly drop. From behind his cabin, a second figure appeared, small, four-legged, and wagging its tail with uncontainable excitement. Duke, John's loyal golden retriever, bounded toward the bear, his usual happy-go-lucky energy on full display. No fear, no hesitation, just pure, innocent curiosity. John's heart pounded. Duke, no, but it was too late. The dog trotted right up to the bear, sniffing at the massive creature's soaked fur as if greeting an old friend. John braced himself, expecting the bear to snarl, to retreat, to react like the apex predator it was. But instead, it just sat there, still, watching, allowing the dog to investigate, to circle, to nudge its damp paw with his wet nose. Duke let out a cheerful bark, his tail wagging even harder. He lowered himself into a playful stance, his front paws stretched forward, Ears perked. The bear blinked. For a moment, John thought that was the end of it, that the bear would rise and lumber away into the woods. But then, something extraordinary happened. The bear mimicked him. Clumsily, slowly, the bear lifted one massive paw and lowered its head slightly, mirroring Duke's posture. Not perfectly, not entirely, but enough to make John's breath hitch. It was responding. Duke barked again, darting in a small circle before coming right back, his joy undeterred. And to John's absolute shock, the bear didn't seem annoyed. If anything, it seemed curious. Interested. John had seen wolves play, had watched cubs tumble over one another in the wild, but he had never seen an interaction like this. A full-grown black bear, a predator of the forest, engaging with a domesticated dog as if it were a companion, not prey. The bear let out a low, rumbling sound, not a growl, not a warning, but something softer, a deep, rolling exhale that seemed almost amused. John exhaled a laugh of his own, shaking his head. Well, I'll be damned. For the next few hours, the two animals stayed within a few feet of each other. Duke followed the bear's every move, sniffing curiously whenever it shifted positions. The bear, for its part, tolerated Duke's boundless energy with surprising patience. By mid-afternoon, John watched as the unthinkable happened. Duke curled up near the bear's side, as if protecting it, and the bear let him. Something in John's chest tightened. He had saved the bear's life, but this was something else entirely. This was trust, maybe even something more. Over the next few days, the bond only grew stronger. The bear remained close to John's cabin, never straying far. Duke took it upon himself to keep watch, circling his new companion, bringing him sticks and dropping them at his feet as if expecting the bear to join in his games. And to John's continued amazement, the bear began learning from Duke. It followed the dog's lead, mirroring his movements, sniffing curiously at the ground when Duke did. It even seemed to relax when Duke was near, its massive frame resting against the earth instead of tensing up at every sound. John had spent decades in the wilderness. He had seen bears in every season, in every stage of survival. He had watched them hunt, watched them fight, watched them roam the forest with raw, untamed power. But he had never seen this. A connection between two creatures who should have been strangers. A friendship that shouldn't have existed. And yet, here it was unfolding right before his eyes. One night, as John sat on his porch, watching Duke and the bear settle beside each other under the moonlight, he realized something. Maybe the bear hadn't just stayed because it was weak. Maybe it had stayed because, for the first time in its life, it wasn't alone. And somehow, John knew this was only the beginning. Because what had started as an impossible rescue had turned into something much bigger. Something miraculous. Days turned into weeks, and what had started as an unlikely friendship between Duke and the bear had become something even deeper. A bond of trust, understanding, and companionship. John had half expected the bear to wander off once it regained its strength, to disappear into the thick forests and return to the wild where it belonged. But it never did. Instead, it stayed, not because it was weak, not because it was lost, but because, somehow, this place had become home. John had always known Duke was a social dog, but what fascinated him the most was how the bear started mimicking him. At first, the changes were small. The bear, which John had started calling Boone, would follow Duke around the clearing, watching him with quiet curiosity. Duke would prance ahead, then look back expectantly, his tail wagging as if to say, "Come on, what are you waiting for?" And, to John's astonishment, Boone would try. The first time he attempted to run after Duke, his large body moved awkwardly, unsure of the speed or the light-footed energy Duke had. But Boone was nothing if not determined. Over time, his movements grew smoother, more confident, and though he'd never matched Duke's agility, he learned to trot after him, engaging in what could only be described as play. One afternoon, John witnessed something he would never forget. Duke had found a thick branch and was gnawing on it happily, tossing it up into the air and catching it. Boone, watching intently, lumbered over and, after a moment of consideration, picked up a branch of his own. John chuckled, shaking his head. "No way. Sure enough, Boone gave his branch a clumsy toss into the air, watching it fall a mere foot away. Duke barked excitedly, running circles around Boone as if congratulating him. And then it happened. Boone tried again and again, until, eventually, they were playing together. It wasn't just play that connected them. It was something deeper. Boone had started sleeping near Duke, choosing the spot outside John's cabin rather than the dark shelter of the woods. At night, John would look out his window and see them curled up together, Duke's golden fur a stark contrast against Boone's thick black coat. There were moments when John would sit on his porch, drinking his morning coffee, and Boone would lumber over and simply sit beside him. He never begged for food, never intruded, just sat in quiet companionship. One evening, as a cold front swept through the forest, John saw something that made his chest tighten. Duke was shivering, the early frost biting through his short fur. Before John could get up to call him inside, Boone shifted, moving closer. Then, in an act of pure instinct, or maybe something more, Boone wrapped his massive body around Duke, shielding him from the cold. John exhaled, the sight nearly bringing a lump to his throat. A wild bear protecting a dog, caring for him. It didn't make sense. And yet, it was happening. Boone had always been hesitant around John, but over time, he began seeking him out, just as he had with Duke. At first, it was small things, lingering a little longer when John spoke, watching him with those deep, intelligent eyes. Then it became more. One evening, John was chopping wood when Boone approached, stopping a few feet away. John stilled, gripping the axe tightly, unsure of what Boone wanted. Then, to his utter disbelief, Boone lay down. Not out of exhaustion, not out of fear, just trust. It was the first time Boone had made himself vulnerable in front of John. John let out a slow breath and set the axe down, moving carefully until he was just a few feet away. "You're not just any bear, are you?" he murmured. Boone blinked at him, his massive head resting on his paws. John sat beside him, silent, letting the quiet of the forest settle between them. That night, for the first time, Boone didn't sleep by the tree line. He slept on John's porch. What had started as an act of survival had turned into something no one could explain. A bear and a dog, two creatures who should have had nothing in common, had become inseparable. Duke had taught Boone how to play. Boone had taught Duke the warmth of protection. And somehow, they had both taught John that the wild and the tame weren't so different after all. One morning, as John watched them chase each other through the field, Duke barking joyfully, Boone huffing in amusement, he realized something. Boone had come into his life by accident. But maybe, just maybe, he was meant to stay. As much as Boone and Duke's bond had grown, it wasn't without its challenges. Their friendship was something out of a storybook, unexpected, heartwarming, and full of unspoken understanding. But the reality was that Boone was still a wild animal, and the world beyond their secluded corner of the forest wasn't as accepting of their unique bond. John knew it was only a matter of time before someone else spotted Boone. He lived near a national park, and while his cabin was deep in the woods, hikers and hunters occasionally wandered too close. Boone had grown comfortable around John and Duke, but what about other humans? One morning, that question was answered. John had been chopping wood when Duke's frantic barking shattered the quiet. He turned just in time to see a group of hikers standing at the edge of the clearing, and Boone standing right in front of them. The hikers froze. One of them shouted, and before John could intervene, Boone reared up on his hind legs, startled by the noise. Screams rang through the air. Someone reached for their phone, probably to call a ranger or worse, report a dangerous bear sighting. "Wait! Stop!" John called, stepping forward with his hands raised. But Boone had already sensed the fear in the air. His deep-set eyes flickered between John and the strangers before he let out a deep, nervous huff and bolted into the trees. John's stomach dropped. Duke barked after him, ready to follow, but John placed a hand on the dog's back. "Give him a second," he murmured, watching the trees shake as Boone disappeared. The hikers were still murmuring, some laughing nervously, others pulling out their phones. "Did you see that? That bear was tame, or something." "No way, man. That was a close call. We should report it." John shook his head. "No need. He's not dangerous." The group exchanged skeptical glances, but John's confidence kept them from pushing further. Eventually, they left, muttering about their crazy encounter. But Boone didn't come back. Not that day. Not the next. For the first time in weeks, Duke was alone. John knew it was only a matter of time before someone else spotted Boone. He lived near a national park, and while his cabin was deep in the woods, hikers and hunters occasionally wandered too close. Boone had grown comfortable around John and Duke, but what about other humans? One morning, that question was answered. John had been chopping wood when Duke's frantic barking shattered the quiet. He turned just in time to see a group of hikers standing at the edge of the clearing, and Boone standing right in front of them. The hikers froze. One of them shouted, and before John could intervene, Boone reared up on his hind legs, startled by the noise. Screams rang through the air. Someone reached for their phone, probably to call a ranger or worse, report a dangerous bear sighting. "Wait! Stop!" John called, stepping forward with his hands raised. But Boone had already sensed the fear in the air. His deep-set eyes flickered between John and the strangers before he let out a deep, nervous huff and bolted into the trees. John's stomach dropped. Duke barked after him, ready to follow, but John placed a hand on the dog's back. "Give him a second," he murmured, watching the trees shake as Boone disappeared. The hikers were still murmuring, some laughing nervously, others pulling out their phones. "Did you see that? That bear was tame, or something." "No way, man. That was a close call. We should report it." John shook his head. "No need. He's not dangerous." The group exchanged skeptical glances, but John's confidence kept them from pushing further. Eventually, they left, muttering about their crazy encounter. But Boone didn't come back. Not that day. Not the next. For the first time in weeks, Duke was alone. Duke didn't take Boone's absence well. The dog paced near the tree line, sniffing, searching, whimpering in confusion. At night, he lay alone by the porch, ears twitching at every distant rustle in the woods. John had never seen Duke so restless. He had to find Boone. So, on the third day, John packed a bag, grabbed Duke's leash, and ventured into the forest. It took hours, following faint trails Boone had left behind. Duke was the real tracker, leading the way, sniffing the air until he stopped. A low whimper left Duke's throat as he stared ahead. John followed his gaze and felt his breath hitch. There, in a small clearing, Boone was curled up at the base of an old oak, his massive frame hunched and withdrawn. His eyes, usually filled with gentle curiosity, looked lost, like it didn't belong anywhere. Duke didn't hesitate. He trotted forward and nudged Boone's thick fur with his nose. Boone barely lifted his head. John sighed, crouching beside them. "Hey, big guy," he said softly. "Scared you back there, didn't they?" Boone let out a deep exhale, shifting slightly. John hesitated before reaching out. Not to touch, but just to be there. "Look, I get it. You're different. You don't fit in with them, but you don't have to run from us." Duke whined, resting his head on Boone's massive paw. Boone blinked down at him. Then, with a slow, heavy movement, he nudged Duke back, just the slightest gesture. But it was enough. John smiled. "Come on, buddy. Let's go home." For a moment, Boone didn't move. Then, slowly he stood, and he followed. After that, things changed. Boone still avoided strangers, but he no longer bolted at the first sign of fear. He stayed close to John's cabin, moving with quiet confidence, always near Duke. And Duke, he never left Boone's side. One night, a pack of coyotes wandered too close, their sharp yips echoing through the clearing. Boone, sensing danger, stood over Duke, his massive form casting a protective shadow. Another day, a harsh storm rolled in, and Boone refused to take shelter in the woods. Instead, he curled up right on John's porch, with Duke tucked against him. John had never seen a bond like theirs. They weren't just companions. They were family. And no matter what challenges came next, one thing was clear. They would face them together. The days passed in a quiet rhythm, Duke and Boone side by side, inseparable as ever. But the real test of their bond came one fateful evening, when the forest itself turned against them. It started with the smell of smoke. John had been inside, fixing up a new latch on the porch door, when Duke suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked. He let out a low, uneasy whine before bolting off toward the tree line. John barely had time to react before he caught the first flicker of orange between the trees. His stomach clenched. Fire. The wildfire had started miles away, but the dry season had turned the forest into a tinderbox. The wind carried the flames fast, spreading them through the underbrush. John ran after Duke, calling his name. "Duke, get back here." But the dog had only one thought in his head, Boone. By the time John reached the clearing, Boone was already there, staring at the creeping flames, his massive body tense. He knew something was wrong. He could feel it in the air, smell it in the wind. Duke barked, circling him, trying to get him to move. But Boone hesitated, and John realized why. He's scared, not of the fire itself, but of leaving, of going somewhere unfamiliar. Boone had made this place his home, and now it was turning against him. John had to act fast. "Boone, listen to me," he shouted, stepping forward, his voice steady but urgent. "You can't stay here. We have to go now." Boone's dark eyes locked onto his, searching for an answer. Then, behind them, a tree snapped, its burning trunk collapsing to the ground with a deafening crack. Duke flinched. Boone did too. And suddenly, he turned and ran. John's heart dropped. "Boone, stop." But Boone was already crashing through the underbrush, pushing deeper into the trees, toward the fire. Duke didn't hesitate. He took off after him, his paws pounding against the dirt. John ran too, lungs burning, weaving between the trees as the heat grew unbearable. Ash rained down like snowflakes, the crackling of flames growing louder. Then Boone stopped, at the edge of a steep ravine, where the fire had already cut off any path forward. Trapped, Duke skidded to a halt beside him, barking furiously. Boone let out a deep, rumbling growl, not at Duke, but at himself. He knew he'd made a mistake. He knew he was trapped, and for the first time, John saw something he never expected to see in the bear's eyes. Panic. There was only one way out. John took a slow step forward, coughing against the smoke. "Boone, you have to trust me," he called, voice rough but steady. "I know you're scared, but you don't have to do this alone." Boone's massive body trembled. The fire was closing in. Duke, desperate, did something John never could have expected. He ran to Boone and pressed his head against his side. A simple gesture, a reminder. You're not alone. Boone looked down at Duke. The fear in his eyes didn't vanish, but something shifted. Then, slowly, he turned back toward John. John held out his hand. "Let's go home." And this time, Boone followed. The fire raged behind them, but together they ran. Duke led the way. Boone stayed close. John pushed forward, guiding them until, finally, they burst through the tree line, back into the safety of the clearing. John collapsed onto the ground, coughing, his hands trembling. Duke flopped beside him, exhausted. And Boone? He stood there for a long moment, his massive frame outlined against the burning forest. Then, slowly, he walked forward and nudged John's shoulder. John exhaled a shaky breath, looking up at the bear who had once been a stranger. "Yeah," he murmured, "you're home." And from that moment on, Boone never ran again. The wildfire eventually burned itself out, leaving behind a scorched landscape where towering trees once stood. But for John, Duke, and Boone, it wasn't destruction they focused on. It was survival. It was trust. It was the unshakable bond that had been tested by fire and come out stronger than ever. In the days that followed, Boone never strayed far again. It was as if the fire had sealed his place in John's world, not just as a wild animal passing through, but as family. Boone adapted in ways John never imagined. He still wandered the woods, his instincts always calling him to the untamed world, but he never disappeared for long. Every evening, like clockwork, he returned to the clearing, where Duke would always be waiting. John often watched the two of them together, a dog and a bear, curled up in the grass as if they had been born brothers. The world outside might not have understood their friendship, but John did. And that was enough. As time passed, word of Boone's rescue spread. People came with questions, with doubts, with fascination. "How did you do it?" they'd ask. "How did a wild bear become so gentle?" John always had the same answer. "I didn't tame him," he'd say. "I just gave him a reason to trust. And isn't that what we all need? A little kindness, a little patience, and someone to remind us that no matter where we come from, no matter how lost we feel, we belong somewhere. Boone found his place, and in doing so, he changed John's life forever. One evening, long after the fire, John sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and crimson. Duke lay at his feet, dozing peacefully, and Boone, he stood at the tree line, watching the sunset, his massive frame silhouetted against the fading light. For a moment, he turned his head, glancing back at John. Their eyes met just for a second. Then Boone rumbled deep in his chest, a sound not of warning, not of fear, but of understanding. And with that, he settled down beside Duke, as if he had always belonged there. John smiled, because he had. He always had.